Whereas many Western democracies turned to government spending and government programs such as the New Deal to combat the worst effects of the Great Depression, other European states adopted a much different approach. Several European nations came to see democracy as a failure, and the real solution to cure economic ills was a strong leader representing a popular movement and party. Many were willing to forsake the traditional benefits of a free and open society to surrender government control in its entirety to a strong nationalist leader. This willingness to adopt totalitarianism would look different in Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union, Spain, and Portugal. But what these states had in common was a belief in the necessity of a strong leader taking sole control of the reins of government to deliver provision and protection for disenchanted and defeated populations. Italy was one of the first European states to resort to totalitarian government after World War I. Italy suffered significant losses during World War I in terms of population and national wealth. Nearly 700,000 Italian soldiers died in World War I, and the war cost Italy 148 billion lira. After changing sides during the war from the Central Powers to the Allies, Italy had received small territorial gains, but more significantly believed it had been cheated by the Versailles Treaty. High inflation destabilized the national economy, and demobilization after the war sparked high unemployment in Italy, creating a restless and dissatisfied class of veterans who were increasingly disillusioned with Italy's weak and corrupt government. Benito Mussolini became one of the earliest faces among the growing fascist movements in Europe during the interwar years. For a time, at the beginning of his power, Mussolini was hailed internationally as a hero and savior of Italy, bringing stability and prosperity to an otherwise struggling state. But many politicians in the West would come to regret their acclaim for Mussolini once it became clear that he was building his own totalitarian state in Italy and would lead Italy into dangerous alliances with fellow enemies of popular government and peace in Europe. Benito Mussolini was an otherwise forgettable individual born in the northern part of Italy. His father was a blacksmith and a socialist, and his mother a devout Catholic. Mussolini was imbibed with some of his earliest enthusiasm for Italian nationalism from his father's celebration of historic Italian heroes. Mussolini struggled to find work and purpose in his early years, working briefly as an elementary teacher. For several years, he became active in socialist politics, but eventually came to see socialism as inadequate to restore Italian greatness. He came to see the future in revolutionary nationalism, in which conflicts between factory owners and workers would be put aside in favor of a unified and united Greater Italy that would eventually restore the glory of the Roman Empire. Running afoul of Italian authorities and refusing to submit to compulsory military service, Mussolini fled Italy seeking work in various locations in southern Europe. He was arrested in Bern, Switzerland in 1903 for revolutionary and socialist activities and returned to Italy. When he later became Prime Minister of Italy, Mussolini would have draft dodgers shot. After exposing himself to increasingly revolutionary and radical authors, Mussolini grew disaffected with the Italian socialists and broke with the party. He advocated for Italian involvement in World War I, seeking to make the war for Italians a war to liberate claimed Italian lands away from foreign enemies and return them as Italian possessions. The new political movement Mussolini helped to create was fascism, from the Latin word fascis, which means bundle, as in bundle of sticks, a symbol of ancient Roman power. Mussolini and the fascists rejected the class warfare and egalitarian aspirations of the socialists, and instead looked to the power of the state, or government, to provide direction, resolution, prosperity, and squelch dissent, rivalry, inefficiency, and division. Mussolini generated support for the fascist movement and party beginning in World War I and into the 1920s. As the director of the fascist newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, Mussolini called for a rejection of the socialists even through violent means, and called for a new Italy that would restore the glories of imperial Rome and consolidate power more into the hands of fascist leadership. Totalitarian governments in the 1930s made extensive use of private gangs or even paramilitary groups to advance the causes of their party and movement. An abundance of often unemployed veterans from World War I were available for these movements. The veterans were seething with discontent and felt abandoned by the nation for which they had fought during the Great War. They were looking for opportunity, employment, strong charismatic leadership, and someone to restore a sense of military glory from the past. The dictators provided for all these needs. Mussolini capitalized on the disillusionment of Italian veterans by inviting them to be the muscle of the fascist movement formed into the Squadristi. The Squadristi conducted parades and a propaganda campaign to trash rival parties and to elevate the fascist party. Socialist newspaper editors were targeted for violence, and their publication offices were frequently sacked in an effort to silence them. The strong and resolute presence of paramilitary groups like the Squadristi seemed reassuring to many down-and-out Italians, and it gave purpose to its members in a manner they had not experienced since the war. This colorful cartoon from 1921 portrays the effect Italian nationalism and fascism could have on previously socialist or communist members. Once imbibed with a healthy dose of nationalism, they too would join the fascist movement. The fascist party under Mussolini's leadership grew in strength, influence, and numbers in the Italian parliament in the early 1920s. Italy, as a constitutional monarchy, could not overlook the appeal of the growing movement. Therefore, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Benito Mussolini as Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. For Mussolini, though, the appointment was not dramatic or captivating enough, and he did not simply want to be viewed as another political appointee. To that end, even though the king had already appointed him to the government as prime minister, Mussolini organized a dramatic march on Rome to accentuate the glory and strength of the fascist movement. The march was designed to pretend the fascists were so strong and appealing that when they demanded power, it was in turn given to them. The march was entirely unnecessary, but it was in keeping with Mussolini's esteem for the Italian past, including Giuseppe Garibaldi's famous marches in the 19th century. Mussolini made sure that Italian newspapers and radios covered the march extensively, turning an extraneous event into a supposedly history-making march. With his ascension to Italian politics, Mussolini was determined not to be like other Italian politicians who would come and go on the whim of the parliament or electorate. Mussolini introduced a new level of toughness in Italian politics, taking the name of El Duce, or the boss, to signify that his regime would not be lacking in decisiveness or power. As a hallmark of totalitarianism, Mussolini increasingly centered the fascist movement around what he wanted or decreed and promoted a cult of personality, with him as the promoted object of the people's affections. Mussolini worked quickly to transform Italian politics. Violence, fraud, and intimidation gave the fascists control of parliament and many of its members, and members of parliament passed a series of laws to secure fascist totalitarian control of the state. Non-fascist newspapers were censored that criticized the Catholic Church, the monarchy, or the state, and certainly El Duce. Mussolini was made head of government, which was more expansive than prime minister, enabling him to rule by decree, that is, dictate his wishes into law. Police were able to arrest state enemies without due process of law, and all anti-fascist parties were dissolved and the secret police Ovra established. Mussolini's face and cult of personality was everywhere in Italy, including the fascist headquarters. Rival parties were driven underground, and dissent was not tolerated. El Duce held large rallies during which he whooped up the crowd in an ecstatic frenzy and delight over his speeches and ideas. Many Italians came to see Mussolini as the savior of Italy, and the beginnings of a revived Roman Empire. OVRA, or Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, was the secret state police arm of Mussolini's government that enforced his decrees and squelched grumbling and dissent. Prisons were filled with enemies of fascism, and more notable critics of the regime were shot, incarcerated, exiled, or suddenly went missing. While 1930s totalitarianism was fashioned with a brute, masculine presentation, the movements towards state control were widely supported by women as well. In fascist Italy, Italian women were encouraged to play the traditional role of wife, mother, and homemaker. Employment outside of the home and female career advancement were discouraged. In fact, Italian women who married young and bore many children were particularly celebrated with awards for fertility, as well as a mother and child holiday. Mussolini gained international notoriety in 1929 when he reached an agreement with the papacy resolving the enduring dispute between the Catholic Church in Rome with the Italian state. The Lateran Accords recognized the sovereignty and independence of the Vatican. Thus, the Church gained full control over its land in Rome and over its jurisdiction. The Church was also promised a large grant from the Italian government for its well-being. In return, the Pope and the Church recognized the fascist state as the legitimate government of Italy and thus used the power of the Catholic Church to draw outstanding Italians to the rank and file of Mussolini's supporters. The papacy's endorsement of Mussolini's dictatorship would cast the Church in a negative light later on, but it did clarify the holdings and role of the papacy in Italy in its relationship to the Italian state. The Lateran Accords remain in effect today, establishing the independence and sovereignty of the Vatican right within the heart of the city of Rome itself. Mussolini garnered applause and acclaim from notable figures around the world, including some famous Americans for his early successes. The Italian economy showed signs of improvement after the war, with unemployment showing reductions. Mussolini famously made the notoriously late Italian trains run on time. Large construction projects were launched under his leadership. Patriotism and nationalism were subtly fused together with support for the fascist party. The Young Fascists was a youth organization that drew young Italians toward fascist ideology and to a reverence of El Duce himself. For many onlookers, Italy under Mussolini had become a model of post-war stability and pride, even if they were not aware of all the dark details. Mussolini hoped to deliver on his promise to restore the glory of ancient Rome by expanding Italian landholdings at the expense of Italy's neighbors and destitute African nations. Mussolini launched Italian invasions of Libya, Tunisia, and eastern Egypt. He claimed portions of the Balkans, including Albania, made forays into France after its defeat by Germany, and seized British Somaliland on the Horn of Africa. Mussolini's military victories were not much, but they did seem to confirm his promises to expand the Italian state and restore its former glory. Aspiring politicians and would-be dictators were attracted to Mussolini's successes, including a young Adolf Hitler in Germany. Mussolini's relationship with Hitler would always be a suspicious and tenuous one, but the two dictators needed each other and, when convenient, took advantage of the Western democracies to back up their boasting and bravado. If totalitarian fascism first gained success in Italy, it reached its pinnacle of power and influence in Germany during the interwar years. Germany became the most famous and infamous example of the appeal of totalitarian fascism in the 1930s, and the dangers and desperations of confining power in too few hands. The tragedy that became Nazi Germany was neither inevitable or necessary, but a proper understanding of its development is imperative to avoid seeing the emergence of such evil in an advanced nation again. Germany was thrown into confusion, depression, civil war, and revolution as a consequence of the First World War. The homeland was neither invaded or destroyed during the war, but facing such possibilities and realizing defeat was imminent, German leadership capitulated to the Allies and became one of the losers from the First World War. German citizens experienced a collapse of morale, felt defeated and humiliated, and wondered what Germany was as a nation after such a humiliating defeat. Once Kaiser William II abdicated, Germany had lost its traditional monarchy and its dynasty and plunged into revolution. The Kaiser would go into exile in the Netherlands, where he would observe all the subsequent changes his previous kingdom experienced in the years to come. After the collapse of the monarchy, Germany reorganized itself into a small, fledgling democracy that would become known as the Weimar Republic. For the first time in its history, Germany was a federated republic. The Constituent Assembly that proclaimed the republic was located in the city of Weimar. The Weimar Republic was a radical break from Germany's historic monarchical past, and the immense challenges it faced during the post-war period always made its success and durability a matter of question. The borders of the Weimar Republic were significantly reduced as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. Portions of Imperial Germany were lost, including Alsace and Lorraine and the Ruhr Valley, as well as a large piece to the east they had been granted to Poland. Trimming off pieces of what was considered historic German soil would only inflame passionate grievances and give rise to demands to restore the original glory of the German fatherland. As a republic, ordinary Germans were enfranchised for the first time and were empowered to vote for members of the Reichstag, or German parliament, every 4 years. Germans voted for a president who would serve a 7-year term. The president served as head of state, as more of a ceremonial figure, whereas the chancellor, whom the president appointed, would serve as prime minister and really run the daily affairs of the country. Paul von Hindenburg, a heroic and esteemed German general from the First World War, was elected president of the Republic in 1925. Even as divisions racked the nation, many Germans placed great faith in Hindenburg as a leader who would do what was best for the nation and bring the competence he demonstrated in the armed forces to the practice of statecraft. In reality, Hindenburg was a rather old man when he entered the presidency, and he was either unaware or unable to master all the forces that were coming into conflict in the nation and government. As a result, in a time of crisis and emerging risk, Germany did not have the involved and capable leader they thought they had in such an hour. Conniving politicians within Hindenburg's government would plot and plan unbeknownst to Hindenburg, leading to bitter consequences. The greatest crisis that Weimar Germany experienced in the post-war period was historic, rampant, and legendary hyperinflation. Germany was humiliated by the $33 billion reparations payment demanded by the Allies after World War I. Germany could never pay such an extravagant amount. Inability to pay inspired the German government to start printing money at an increasingly rapid pace. The value of the German mark plummeted as the abundance of printed money led to a collapse in its value. Out of frustration of not receiving its demanded reparations payment, France added to Germany's post-war humiliation by occupying the Ruhr Valley, which was rich in mines and factories. The Weimar Republic continued to print money, and the value continued to collapse. A 50 million mark banknote issued in 1923, which would have been worth approximately 12 million US dollars 9 years earlier, was now only worth $1 US when issued, and then worth practically nothing a few weeks later. Some Weimar money was so cheap it was only printed on one side. Other notes were printed crooked. Ridiculously high values appeared on a single paper banknote, such as 50 million marks. Germans found alternative uses for the cheap and worthless paper money. Here a citizen is using a 1 million mark note as note paper. These children are using stacks and blocks of Weimar money to play with as building blocks, as they are cheaper than actually purchasing real wooden building blocks. Firewood or coal was much more expensive than Weimar money as well, and therefore this woman is using stacks of her money as something cheap to start a fire. Sometimes German citizens would wheel an entire wheelbarrow of money to the local grocer or butcher to purchase food. Sometimes a thief would dump out the money and steal the wheelbarrow. German currency was not stabilized until the government introduced the Rentenmark, which was based on the material wealth of all of Germany, equaled 1 million of the old marks, and was exchanged at a rate of $1 to 4.2 Rentenmarks. Even by the time the German currency was stabilized, the damage had been done permanently, damaging the average German citizen's faith in the government and its policies. With the collapse of the German currency and the simultaneous inability of England and France to pay its war debts to the United States, a new plan was crafted to rescue the international finance system and restart growth after the destruction of the war. A plan was crafted to break the logjam by American banker Charles Dawes. Dawes proposed the United States granting $2.5 billion in loans to Germany, which in return would be able to start paying reparations to the Allies. The Allies, Britain and France, would then be able to start repaying their debts to the United States for munitions purchased during the war. The Dawes Plan did not settle all of Germany's interwar finance issues, but the plan did buy some years of stability for the Weimar Republic to get on its feet and to continue. Nevertheless, the consequences of hyperinflation as well as crippling unemployment numbers continued to dog the Weimar Republic even into the 1930s. In 1930, unemployment rose to almost 16%, and it rose to almost 31% in 1932. The German population was growing increasingly restless and more susceptible to alternative or radical solutions to the problems of government and the economy. Long lines formed outside of job centers seeking employment opportunities that often were not there by the time they reached the end of the line. Scenes of destitution and hunger continued in Germany into the 1930s. Soup kitchens and food banks continued to serve large numbers who bordered on or experienced malnourishment. Particularly humiliating and embarrassing for Germany was the large number of veterans who felt abandoned and betrayed by the Armistice and Versailles Treaty. Many were left with debilitating injuries to fend for themselves or reduced to begging on city streets. The pride of the nation felt that victory was in grasp during the First World War and that it was stolen from them by anti-German forces within the government. Into this vacuum of poverty, hunger, and humiliation, a multitude of movements and political parties competed for the loyalty of the German population and its disillusioned veterans. Neighboring Russia had formed a communist state just a few years ago in 1917, and many felt that a defeated Germany was next to experience a communist revolution. German communist parties organized marches and drew support from a growing portion of the population, even if they continued to be viewed with suspicion by more conservative Germans. Many saw German communism as the answer for the nation's ills, but many as well sought any solution or movement that could block the rise of the communists and prevent a Bolshevik takeover of the nation. Interwar Germany, particularly the cities, could be a very lawless and violent place, as many groups of disaffected Germans organized themselves into independent paramilitary groups called Freikorps. The Freikorps had often commandeered military equipment, remained in uniform, and assembled weapons. The Freikorps could hire themselves out to the highest bidder, or take causes into their own hands by roughing up opposition journalists, sacking newspaper offices or party offices, or even conducting pitched battles against rival Freikorps in the streets of the Weimar Republic. The Freikorps provided the morale many German veterans were seeking, and at the very least gave veterans something to do rather than stand in long unemployment lines. Members of Freikorps units rallied around a specific mythology stemming from World War I that asserted the heroic German soldier was on the verge of winning World War I and then suddenly was stabbed in the back, betrayed by treasonous and sinister forces exercising power on the home front, while soldiers were fighting at the front. The sinister doing the stabbing could be traitors, leftists, communists, or other hidden groups in the government. But inevitably, the German Jew was particularly fingered as the true perpetrator of betraying the German army. The stab in the back myth became a powerful myth for disaffected veterans, nurtured existing German anti-Semitism, and provided an excuse for the defeated army as well as a pretext for future revenge. Into this divided, violent, disillusioned, and humiliated German population stepped the leader of the movement that would unify these discontented groups and turn their rage into rebuilding Germany and enacting its revenge against the rest of the world. Adolf Hitler has earned the image of one of the most evil leaders of all time, and is often casually invoked to suggest how bad something is. But the innocuous uses of Hitler in his name today should not obscure a proper understanding of his significance in history and how he was able to unleash such an evil ideology on a nation and the world. In a bit of irony for someone who espoused the heroic German throughout his life, Hitler himself was not German. He was Austrian. He was born in Braunau am Inn in Austria to otherwise unknown and forgettable parents. Hitler's father, Aloy, was a junior customs official who regularly wore a military uniform and aspired to the esteem and respect true military service invoked in German society. Aloy was married 3 times, the third time to a household servant named Clara Posel. Aloy Hitler was a surly man who spoke harshly towards his wife when he did speak to them, and regularly beat fiercely his wife and his children. Aloy Hitler was a surly man who spoke harshly towards his wife and children when he did speak to them, and regularly beat fiercely his family. Hitler's mother, Clara, was a devout Roman Catholic and regularly took her children to church. She endured her husband's rages and violence without complaining and showered affection on her children, particularly her son Adolf. She always expressed great admiration for his paintings. Hitler wrote in his biography later on that he honored his father, but he loved his mother. The mother and son relationship, however, was cut short when Clara died of breast cancer in 1907. Hitler was devastated and felt alone after his mother's death. More than anything else, the young Adolf Hitler aspired to be an artist. He painted watercolors, particularly postcards in his youth and even as a young man. The paintings demonstrate some worthy ability, but when Hitler applied for admission to the Vienna Academy of Art, he was rejected and felt the pain of the disappointment deeply. In another bitter irony, if the Academy had accepted Hitler and launched him onto a career as an artist, the world may have been spared one of the most evil dictators of all time. Hitler's artwork continues to fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars at auctions still today. After the failure of his art career, Hitler struggled to get by or find meaningful work. He wandered poorhouses and was exposed to other more disaffected and radical members of society. When the Imperial German government declared war at the beginning of World War I in 1914, Adolf Hitler can be seen in this large crowd in Munich cheering the outbreak of the war. The First World War provided an opportunity for young nationalistic Germans like Hitler to have purpose and some income. Eagerly, Hitler joined up with the German army and rose to the rank of corporal. He served on several fronts as a message courier. Hitler's term of service in the army, however, was cut short when he was injured in a gas attack, temporarily blinded, and confined to a hospital. Hitler then heard of the Germans surrendering to the Allies and that the war was over. He was stunned and furious. He saw no reason for the mighty German army to surrender and believed, like many others, that the German soldier had been betrayed by political and sinister forces. Again, with nothing to do after the war and after being discharged from the army, Hitler took a vigorous interest in politics and nascent political parties. He joined a little-known and small socialist party known as the German Workers' Party. The party was composed of far-right nationalists who were particularly anti-Semitic. Hitler quickly rose to the top of the party apparatus particularly for his strong oratory skills. Soon the party was reorganized and renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, with the acronym NSDAP, which for shorthand was referred to as the Nazi Party. The strong arm connected to the Nazi Party, another free corps in Germany, was the Sturmbanndelung, or the brown shirts. The brown shirts were modeled on Mussolini's black shirts and served a similar purpose. Their neat-fitting uniforms that invoked disciplined military service was appealing to otherwise unemployed men and gave a cause and purpose to the disaffected after the war. The brown shirts would often be the public face of the Nazi Party, as they conducted a vigorous propaganda campaign to promote the party, organized marches, parades, distributed leaflets, guarded party meetings, and roughed up or employed violence against political opponents, particularly communist groups. Hitler believed the Weimar Republic was so fragile in 1923 that a vigorous push by a well-organized party would topple the government and a new state would be created under Nazi control. The German word for the toppling of a government, or coup, is Putsch, and therefore the attempt of the Nazis in 1923 to do so after gathering in a Munich beer hall is known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Many groups like the Nazis would attempt to organize a putsch throughout the Weimar years and topple the government and fail and be forgotten. If not for Hitler's later success, this failed putsch would be forgotten too. The Beer Hall Putsch ultimately never had a chance of succeeding in its ambition to take over the government in 1923. Nazi Party members and other adventurers gathered in the Munich Beer Hall, nevertheless, in early November 1923, where Hitler inspired them to take action immediately against the government. Hitler took to the stage and, failing to be heard above the crowd, fired a shot into the air and announced the revolution had begun. The 2,000 Nazis were instructed to take to the streets and challenge the government and commence marching after the model of Mussolini's March on Rome. Hitler and his fellow Nazis took to the Munich streets, where they were confronted by the police. In the ensuing chaos, the rebels were dispersed, beaten, and shot, collapsing the failed putsch. 16 Nazis were shot dead in the streets, including the marcher next to Hitler. The putsch failed, and many Nazis were arrested. Hitler fled to the countryside, where 2 days later he was arrested and charged with treason. Hitler was put on trial with fellow Nazi conspirators on this charge of high treason. It was during his trial that Hitler demonstrated the shrewd oratory that would secure him power successfully 10 years later. Hitler admitted his guilt to the court, but turned to the judge and dared him to admit that he too was dissatisfied with the present government and wanted it changed as well. Hitler bragged about his courage to challenge the state in the putsch and that his vision for a greater Germany was born in the trenches of World War I, and that he would not be denied creating a greater Germany for the future of his fellow Germans. Hitler was convicted, but due to his courtroom speeches, won over the trial judge. The judge decided Hitler had honorable but misguided motives. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he would only serve a little over 8 months in Landsberg prison due to good behavior. Hitler existed quite comfortably for his 8 months in prison. He is pictured here with his henchmen in a comfortable room that includes a tablecloth, pictures, and flowers. Hitler's trial had only increased his image and notoriety that he was extensively visited in prison, so much so that he instructed his jailer to stop admitting so many guests so that he might get some work done. While in prison, Hitler commenced writing his autobiography and political manifesto. He entitled Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Mein Kampf provides some details regarding Hitler's early life, but the significance of the book is really the ideas that Hitler puts forth and then later implements as Chancellor of Germany. The pages are filled with a strong German nationalism coupled with vicious anti-Semitism. He warns of a Jewish peril and once again pinpoints the Jews as responsible for Germany's betrayal at the end of World War I. Hitler makes clear he despises communism and the threat the Reds pose for the future of Germany. He articulates the superiority of some peoples and races, such as the Aryan Germans, and declares such superior races have a right to Lebensraum, or additional living space in which to dwell and prosper. Furthermore, society produces superior individuals that have a right to demonstrate authoritarian leadership over the masses. Mein Kampf became a national bestseller once Hitler became chancellor in 1933. The failed Beer Hall Putsch was a critical event in Hitler's political education. The failed attempt to overthrow the government taught him that a major democracy could never be overtaken or overthrown in a violent revolt. Rather, democracies must be changed from within, and that power must be taken from within the system by undermining it. To that end, after his release from prison, Hitler worked to refine his image and move away from popular conceptions of him as a gangster or violent political thug. Early film reels and newspaper outlets were used to refine Hitler's image and promote the Nazis as a legitimate political movement that respectable society would want to be a part of. Young people were particularly invited to be a part of the movement. Nazi stormtroopers marching in parades, swastika flags, and large rallies with Hitler speaking became the mainstays of Nazi promotion and recruitment. The organization and enthusiasm of the Nazis carried enormous appeal to larger and larger sections of the German population, as still by 1932, over 6 million unemployed Germans believed extremist solutions for Germany were appealing. There are two common misconceptions regarding Hitler's rise to power in Germany. The first is that Hitler seized power in a violent coup or putsch for himself. The second is that the German people voted him into office. Both are false. In reality, and tragically, Hitler was handed power, given his position in the government by conniving politicians who cared more about securing their own positions rather than noticing the dangerous man that was rising in their ranks. Two particularly politicians, former Chancellor Franz von Papen and his main rival, Defense Minister Kurt von Schleicher, let their own rivalry blind them to Hitler's rise. Papen convinced President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor or leader of the government, believing Hitler would be a puppet for his own interests and just a temporary figure in German politics. Von Papen could not have been more wrong. Ironically and tragically, even as Nazi membership in the Reichstag or German parliament was strong but still not a majority, the aged Hindenburg agreed to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. President Hindenburg really had no idea regarding who he had just given the reins of government. As Chancellor, Hitler had to work with the Reichstag to pass legislation and stay in the good graces of the president, but this was not the absolute power that Hitler was really looking for. Hitler was looking for an opportunity to expand his control over the German state. The new chancellor found that opportunity on February 27, 1933, when a massive fire broke out in the Reichstag building, completely consuming the structure. With little investigation or evidence, Hitler and the Nazis immediately blamed the communists and particularly Jewish influences for intentionally setting the National Parliament building on fire. Even today, historians are not certain who or which group was responsible for the blaze. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the Nazis themselves lit the building on fire to generate a sense of crisis that they could subsequently take advantage of. The Nazis moved quickly to dispatch stormtrooper units to bust up meetings of German communists and imprison without charge or trial those deemed to be enemies of the Nazi Party. Hitler took the even more ambitious step of calling the Reichstag fire an emergency for the government and demanding emergency and supposedly temporary powers to deal with the threat. Again, it is important to note it is not at all clear that there is an emergency against the government. But Hitler was determined to make full use of a perceived crisis to accumulate more power for himself. The bill the Nazis put before the reconstituted Reichstag meeting away from its burned-out building was called the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act enabled Hitler to take on the powers of a dictator. Hitler's government would be able to create decrees and negotiate treaties independently without approval. It was even acceptable if these laws were unconstitutional and they could not be abolished. The bill also declared the office of president would be abolished upon the death of President Hindenburg. These dictatorial powers were only supposed to last 4 years, but of course Hitler had no intention of surrendering these powers after any duration. The Nazis intimidated other Reichstag members into voting for the Enabling Act, and once passed, Germany had in reality become a dictatorship under Adolf Hitler. After the passage of the Enabling Act, Hitler launched a brutal campaign against all opposition leaders to the Nazi Party in Germany and settled old scores who had opposed him during his ascent to power. Hitler showed no loyalty to those such as Ernst Röhm, leader of the stormtroopers who had helped him rise to power. Hitler intentionally purged the stormtrooper brown shirt leadership so that they posed no threat to him. Other ministers of the government who had opposed the Nazis were purged. Ernst Röhm and other stormtrooper leaders were suddenly awakened in the middle of the night and arrested. Most were subsequently shot. At least 85 people died during the purge, but most likely the Nazis eliminated hundreds of their enemies, either real or imagined, during the purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. With any internal threat eliminated by executing the leadership of the stormtroopers, Hitler won over the absolute loyalty of the German army. On August 2, 1934, soldiers of the German army recited the Wehrmacht oath of loyalty not to the nation of Germany and not to the German Constitution, but the exclusive person of Adolf Hitler himself. The oath they recited declared, "I swear to God this sacred oath that to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, I shall render unconditional obedience, and that as a brave soldier I shall at all times be prepared to give my life for this oath." With the capitulation of the German army, the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler was in place and would remain for over 11 years. The vast majority of Germans came to accept and revere Adolf Hitler because his aggressive building programs and militarism pulled Germany out of the Great Depression. One of the more visible of his accomplishments was the vast expansion of the German highway system, or Autobahn. The Volkswagen, or people's car, was also enormously popular, put Germans on the road, and created a sense of nationality and unity that Germans had lacked in the 1920s. Unemployment was almost non-existent as German citizens were required to build up the nation's infrastructure or its armaments. Even Germans who had concerns or reservations about Hitler were willing to look the other way because the economic results were tangible and visible. It is worthwhile to consider the henchmen Hitler brought with him to power and who were instrumental in the creation of the Nazi state. Hermann Goering was a World War I fighter ace who joined the Nazi Party shortly after World War I. He participated in the failed Beerholt Putsch and was injured in the event. He assisted in the creation of the Gestapo and the construction of the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force. Hitler gave him broad powers over the Nazi state as Reichsmarschall and was considered to be Hitler's successor. In reality, he was second only to Hitler in Nazi Germany during World War II. Heinrich Himmler served but did not see action during the First World War. As a member of the Nazi Party, Hitler entrusted him with the creation of the most feared military unit in Nazi Germany. The Schutzstaffel, or Protection Squad, more commonly known as the SS, was a paramilitary group in Nazi Germany that enforced state security. The Waffen-SS was the military branch of the SS that acted as military police during World War II. Most notably, the SS created by Heinrich Himmler implemented the final solution, or the extermination of 6 million European Jews. The SS was responsible for mass killings and the construction and implementation of the concentration camps across Nazi-occupied territories. The Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing units, traveled with the German army and executed thousands of Jews across Europe. The Gestapo was similar to the SS, but acted more as a state police force that enforced Nazi ideology and compliance and stamped out dissent on the home front. Himmler took control of the Gestapo from Goering and made it one of the most feared organs in the German government by ordinary German citizens. Joseph Goebbels was not a soldier, but a scholar who had earned a doctorate in philology from the University of Heidelberg in 1921. He was an early member of the Nazi Party and quickly earned Hitler's respect and admiration. Goebbels served as Minister of Propaganda for the Third Reich from 1933 to 1945. Goebbels was particularly adept at using the new mediums of radio and film to promote Nazi propaganda. He was violently anti-Semitic, and the Nazi propaganda he oversaw promoted anti-Semitism and endeavored to promote morale and enthusiasm for the Nazi Party and the German war effort during World War II. He was one of Hitler's most trusted associates. Not a member of the Nazi leadership, but nevertheless an important figure in Nazi Germany and in the life of Adolf Hitler, was Eva Braun. Braun, as a young woman, became a photographer and formed connections with members of the Nazi Party. She became romantically involved with Hitler in the early 1930s and personally took many of the photographs and videos we have today of Hitler. By most accounts, she was unstable and drinking heavily toward the end of her life. She would eventually marry Hitler on the last night of their lives in a small ceremony in an underground bunker before they both committed suicide together the very same night. The Nazis brought about a radical transformation of German culture with several key departures from the Weimar era. Public morality was more closely regulated. Much of modern art was condemned and banned. Numerous authors who espoused ideas at odds with the Third Reich were exiled, banned, and had their books burned in public squares. Authors and ideas that reinforced Nazi principles, particularly racial hierarchies and anti-Semitism, were celebrated and advanced. More than any other political movement in the 1930s, the Nazis made effective use of radio and film. The most notable example of Nazi film propaganda was Triumph of the Will, a 1935 propaganda film staged, directed, and filmed by Leonid Riefenstahl. The film chronicled the 1934 Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg and included 700,000 attendees in innovative cinematography to accentuate the grandeur and drama of the event. The Triumph of the Will captivated audiences and reinforced popular esteem for the Nazi movement. Hitler intentionally sought to draw Nazi support from the youth of Germany with the creation of the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth recruited German males ages 14 to 18, and a different organization recruited 10 to 14-year-old males. The Hitler Youth propagandized German youth towards the Nazi Party in a quasi-paramilitary organization and was the only legally recognized youth organization in Nazi Germany for young males. Young women and girls were organized into the League of German Girls in Germany, which was the only legally recognized organization for young girls in Nazi Germany. An abundance of German mythology and folklore was employed to train young girls in their roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers. Young Nazi women were encouraged to avoid racially defiling themselves with other inferior races, and to bear children that could grow up to become soldiers for the Reich. The reach of the Nazi state also extended into the German churches. The Nazis moved early to Nazify the Catholic and Lutheran churches in Germany and incorporate them into a national Reich church. The minority that opposed these new Nazi innovations in the church were known as the Confessing Church. The National Reichschurch of Germany would claim exclusive control over all churches. Publication of the Bible would cease. Crucifixes, Bibles, and saints were to be removed from altars. Mein Kampf would be placed on altars as to the German nation and therefore to God, the most sacred book. The Christian cross would be removed from all churches and replaced with the swastika. Nazi theologians in the employ of the state rejected the traditional tenets of Christianity and replaced Christian dogma with new Nazi revelations. Only a small but brave group resisted Nazi innovations in the church. Prominent members included Karl Barth, the Swiss theologian who wrote extensively on Scripture and Orthodox Christian teaching. Martin Niemöller, the Lutheran pastor, was originally a Hitler supporter, but then opposed the Nazi innovations in the church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and theologian who refused to submit to Hitler's authority over the church. He continued to teach in a confessing church seminary that met privately on the shores of the Baltic Sea to avoid detection. Bonhoeffer initially fled Germany, but then chose to return to Nazi Germany, realizing that he must suffer alongside his people. Bonhoeffer became involved in one of the conspiracies to assassinate Hitler and was eventually arrested. Bonhoeffer was imprisoned at Flossenburg concentration camp, where he was hanged for treason in 1945. Alarmed by the trends in the Nazified state church, members of the Confessing Church composed the Brahman Declaration. The statement of faith specifically renounced the Führer's authority over the German church and reasserted traditional Christian doctrine. Only Jesus Christ was the head of the Christian church, and not a national leader, however popular, declared the declaration. While Hitler did enjoy widespread popularity as chancellor, there were significant segments of the population that simply just tolerated or accepted him. And there were other segments of the population, though illegal to do so, outright opposed him. A small group of Germans formed a resistance movement that endeavored to topple the Nazis and particularly assassinate Hitler. There were many attempts to assassinate Hitler, but the attempt that came the closest to success was attempted in 1944, largely through the efforts of Claus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg grew disaffected with the Nazis after being injured in North Africa, and working with other resistance members, they hatched a plan to place a bomb near Hitler in his secret bunker. The plan was executed on July 20th, 1944, and came very close to succeeding. Stauffenberg placed a briefcase with the bomb under a large table at which Hitler and other senior Nazi leadership were meeting, and silently he slipped out of the room. Moments later, the bomb exploded, tossing the table up and over and knocking over Hitler and others in the room. The explosion killed 4 individuals in the room, but Hitler suffered only small injuries. Most likely, the large, heavy table shielded him from the worst effects of the blast. Stauffenberg and the other conspirators were hunted down by the Gestapo and arrested. Thousands more were incarcerated and executed. Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad. In a final act of defiance against the Nazis and demonstration of his patriotism, Stauffenberg's last words at his execution were, "Long live our sacred Germany." Hitler would dodge several assassination attempts throughout his life and remained the absolute power in Germany until he took his own life in April 1945. After securing power as a communist dictator and securing the revolution through the course of the Civil War, Lenin is actually exhausted from the event, and he suffers a series of very debilitating strokes in the early 1920s that is going to leave him completely physically and mentally incapacitated at the end of his life and going to lead to a struggle for power upon his death in the early 1920s. There's a large state funeral that is conducted shortly after. A large tomb is constructed in Red Square in Moscow, but Lenin's body is never buried. Indeed, the blood is drained out of his body, and he is injected with a multitude of chemicals and using extensive makeup, Lenin's body is preserved, still is preserved today inside of Lenin's tomb in this mausoleum, presented for public display where visitors and tourists can still march 2 by 2 into Lenin's tomb, maintaining silence and continual walking, and walk around and view the body of Vladimir Lenin. The death of Lenin, the competent and charismatic leader of the Russian Revolution, leads to a great power struggle on who will succeed Lenin in control of the Soviet Union. Two prominent names emerge. One of them was completely expected and logical in Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had been there from the very beginning. He had worked with Lenin when they were outlaws and had been subject to the surveillance of the Tsar's secret police by the Okhrana. And Leon Trotsky had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War, securing victory for the Bolsheviks against the Whites and securing the Bolshevik state, the Soviet Union, and had also written extensively about communism, and was a strong advocate of international revolution. He was a firm believer in the Comintern, and the Comintern promoting communist revolution around the world. That now that communism is secured in Russia, we shouldn't stop. We should work to spread it around the world. To the exhausted, exasperated, and completely beaten down population of Russia, though, that didn't sound like a really appealing idea. What was really needed was to focus on Russia and to heal its multiple problems after the early 20th century. The other contender to control the Soviet Union after Lenin's death was unexpected. This was Joseph Stalin. Stalin really was a minor official and played a very minor, if not negligible, role in the course of the Russian Revolution. Stalin had a long history of revolutionary activities, but he was in prison for much of the events of the Russian Revolution. He wasn't a key player, but he's going to constantly portray himself as Lenin's right-hand man, and indeed the premier leader of the Russian Revolution, to those who aren't aware of what really happened. Stalin opposed Trotsky's idea of promoting international revolution and advocated what he called socialism in one country, securing the revolution in Russia and healing Russia's problems before proceeding any further. Now, there's a clear power struggle here between Stalin and Trotsky, and the question was who would take over after Lenin. Many people just assumed Trotsky would take over. But with the death of Lenin, a major state event occurs with the funeral of Lenin, where it's important for all the Bolshevik leaders to gather for Lenin's funeral to pay respects to their revolutionary hero. However, Stalin had arranged for the trains to be delayed in the southern part of the country where Trotsky was upon Lenin's death. Therefore, Trotsky is not able to get back to Moscow in time for Lenin's funeral. That's a huge embarrassment. And then gradually Stalin, forming a coalition of supporters and making promises and forming an alliance, drives Trotsky out of the country, away from power, where eventually Trotsky is forced to flee the country. Therefore, gradually and through great manipulation and stealth and promises, Joseph Stalin is able to secure control over the party and over the country. He actually invents a new title that's going to be important for subsequent communist leaders, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in Eastern Europe, that of General Secretary. Generally, secretaries are not those that are in charge. But Stalin, who had kept the books, if you will, for the Bolsheviks leading up to the Russian Revolution, had been able to get to know a lot of the members of the party across the country. And therefore, he used his connections to drive out Trotsky and secure his own power, and indeed calls himself the General Secretary of the Communist Party, a title he will hold all the way until his death. Stalin was from the Russian state of Georgia in the south, in the Caucasus. He was a peasant. He was the son of a very violent alcoholic father who frequently beat his mother and assaulted him as a boy. Stalin's mother wanted nothing else for her son than to become a priest, and indeed enrolls her son in the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary in Georgia, where, needless to say, Stalin does not last long in his seminary activities and prefers the action of revolutionary activities. Stalin, from a very young age, people talked about his very cold, detached, distant eyes, that from a very young age, he demonstrated no empathy. He was immune to watching people suffer in front of him through pain or death, and seemed to express no remorse. And indeed, he begins his own revolutionary activities at a young age and becomes fascinated by communism, radical activities, and the Bolshevik group. He is also the editor of Pravda, which is the earliest Bolshevik newspaper promoting Bolshevik propaganda. Stalin will be arrested multiple times by the Tsar's secret police for his revolutionary activities. Indeed, he'll serve sentences also in Siberia that prevent him from participating in a lot of the events of the Russian Revolution. Stalin will be married twice. His first wife will commit suicide, and his second wife he'll have violent arguments with, particularly after Stalin would drink heavily. Stalin had two sons. His first son will be captured during World War II, and the Germans hope to negotiate a prisoner release for the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin refuses and doesn't care about getting his son returned to him, and therefore his son Yakov endeavors to escape a German prisoner of war camp and is shot down on the barbed wire when he attempts to escape, with no remorse from his father upon his death. Vasily Dugashvili, the other son of Joseph Stalin, dies of chronic alcoholism and probably suicide by gunshot in the very presence of Stalin. Upon seeing his son, who had shot himself, Stalin expressed no remorse and reportedly said, "Fool can't even shoot straight." Stalin did seem to demonstrate a lot of affection for his one daughter, Svetlana, and seemed to be rather tender with her. Svetlana would eventually come to the West and also live in the United States, where she at times would be very critical of her father's policies, but also frequently support them. Because Stalin was not with Lenin with the key events leading up to the Russian Revolution, he often portrayed himself through photographs as the right-hand man of Lenin. So, for example, this photograph is a complete fabrication. It's not a real photograph, in which Stalin superimposed his own image next to Lenin as if they are planning together, consulting each other for the progress of the Russian Revolution. And indeed, when Stalin finally comes to power and Lenin is removed, Stalin plots with other Bolsheviks, including Alexei Rykov, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Zinoviev, to remove Trotsky. Stalin gives Rykov, Kamenev, and Zinoviev all these promises that once he's in power, they will rule with him, and of course breaks all those promises once he secures his own power. And indeed, Trotsky is forced to flee the country to Finland, to the United States, and eventually Trotsky makes it all the way to Mexico, where in Mexico he becomes a very vocal critic, criticizing Stalin, saying that Stalin has betrayed the communist Bolshevik revolution, and what is really being instituted in the Soviet Union is Stalinism and not Bolshevism. And therefore, it is believed that Stalin commissioned a Mexican assassin named Ramon Mercader to kill Leon Trotsky in his home where he was living in 1940 in Mexico, killing Trotsky with an ice pick, stabbing him in the head. Once Stalin comes to power in the Soviet Union, realizing that Russia is full of economic problems, economically backward again, and has suffered so much war and revolution and famine and desolation, Stalin is determined to industrialize Russia on a scale never before seen. He launches what becomes known as the 5-year plans. The 5-year plans were 5-year scheduled plans in which the industrial sector of the Soviet Union would have quotas to produce a certain number of factories, a certain number of tractors, a certain number of automobiles, or large-scale projects, and they would have 5 years to do this. Therefore, these very high quotas were set, for example, at a tractor plant, that a certain factory had to produce 500 tractors in the next year. Government officials would come back with KGB agents
and enforce the quotas. If that factory had not produced 500 working tractors after a year, then the leaders of the factory could be imprisoned, sent to work at labor camps, or shot. Therefore, it does lead to massive industrial production, but it also leads to enormous accounting errors, fraud, lying, and dilapidated goods. Because in an effort to avoid their own executions and reach the industrial quotas, frequently factories would lie, or they would produce tractors that didn't actually have a motor or missing key parts. The 5-year plans were also instituted for the creation of dams and canals with disastrous consequences, because quite often large-scale projects like a dam were constructed, but because there was so much rushing in order to meet the schedule and meet the quota and not suffer persecution from the state under the 5-year plans, that foundations were not properly dug or poured with cement, and therefore whole superstructures collapse because of the rushing and the lying that is taking place. Nevertheless, massive industrialization does take place in the Soviet Union under the first and second 5-year plans, with enormous output of coal and iron and steel and cement, locomotives, tractors, trucks, as well as fabrics. During Stalin's reign under the 5-year plans, this is when the Soviet Union really becomes a communist state. Stalin delivers on the Bolshevik promise to institute communism, rejecting Lenin's new economic policy and free market economics of the past, institutes collectivized farm. It is hard to overstate the disaster that Stalin's collectivized farms creates in the countryside of Russia, because no longer were private family farms allowed, but rather entire small farms were combined into large government farms in which Russian peasants were forced to work. These fields do not produce nearly enough food for Russia. There's massive inefficiency, tremendous lying, enormous suffering and death and famine across Russia in these farms because the government is running them so poorly. Often, Stalin used food as a weapon and would use the government to confiscate so much of the food produced on one collectivized farm and then use it for the Bolshevik army or relocate it to other areas of Russia. It leads to massive food shortages and another famine in the early 1930s, often called the Holodomor, known as the Terror Famine. Particularly in the Ukraine, the effects of the Holodomor are devastating, in which millions and millions of Ukrainians and White Russians and other Russians are starved to death, often with starved bodies laying in the streets. They hadn't eaten in months, leading to their demise. Often the bodies just left in the streets to rot in the sun. With so much criticism of Stalin and his policies, Stalin is determined to enforce his rule and therefore enacts the Great Purges. So once again, if Russia hadn't already suffered enough through all revolution and World War I and the Civil War and Lenin's famine and now the Holodomor and the collectivized farm and the 5-year plans, now Stalin launches a great purge. He says that there are great enemies against his rulership and against the Bolsheviks, enemies of the revolution. And indeed, Trotsky is assassinated in Mexico. Kamenev and Zinoviev, who were so important for the ascension of Stalin to power, they are given sham trials and executed. Many of the leaders of the Russian Revolution who knew Stalin was not involved in the Russian Revolution and was not a key player, key leader, they are put on trial and removed from power because Stalin doesn't want their testimony that he wasn't an important leader during the Russian Revolution. Many of the leaders of the Russian Revolution are accused, and Stalin promises them if at court they will admit their crimes, their lives will be preserved, and so will the lives of their families. And therefore, leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution who were key to the revolution under Lenin are put on trial. They admit to crimes they didn't do because they believe Stalin will protect them and their families. Once the trial is over and those recordings and the news makes it into the newspapers that these people admit to their crimes, then Stalin has them executed anyway, and their families and their extended families. Numerous Bolshevik members, revolutionary leaders, army commanders, all of them removed, most of them executed many forced confessions due to beatings, torture, threat, false promises. There is a horrendous, massive purge of the army. All the senior general staff, subordinate officers, all removed from command of the army. Stalin believing that they are plotting against him, resulting in the removal of 3 of 5 marshals, 5-star generals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 army corps commanders, 154 out of 186 division commanders, 16 out of 16 army commissars, and 25 out of 28 army corps commissars. The entire leadership of the army is removed at the very critical moment that Stalin is going to need qualified military leadership with the German invasion of Russia in 1941 that's coming in World War II. But there are numerous stories of Russian families, including the future Mikhail Gorbachev, who talked about a knock at the door in the middle of the night and his grandfather taken away, sent to a labor camp, or executed. So many family members never found again. So many names in the phone books of St. Petersburg and Moscow and major Russian cities simply disappear. The names in the phone book are reduced because somewhere around 20 million people died during Stalin's reign, apart from the millions that died because of World War II. The purges, the 5-year plans, the labor camps, the Holodomor all result in 20 million of his own people killed by his policies. Here's another example of Stalin photoshopping people out of a photograph. Nikolai Yezhov was key for the construction of this canal, and Stalin had the top picture taken with him to celebrate the accomplishment. But seeing greater propaganda value in just celebrating his own value, he removes Yezhov from the picture to make it look like Stalin himself was responsible for the construction of the canal. Those individuals who were not murdered were often sent to the Gulag. The Gulag were labor camps, particularly in Siberia. These are concentration camps, but usually they're work camps. You can see that the number of Gulags just explode during Stalin's tenure and also during the period of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of these camps across the country where prisoners, usually falsely accused, live in horrible conditions, starving to death, live outside in the elements, very cold, very hot, where they perform menial tasks, often breaking rocks for the point of breaking rocks, no productive purpose whatsoever, digging trenches, often digging their own graves. Then subsequently they are shot and placed in their own grave where they dug. These labor camps occur across the country, resulting in millions more lost through the suffering and death with no record that their families can research of whatever happened to their family members. Stalin, who is also an avowed atheist, was also responsible for endeavoring to de-Christianize the Soviet Union and blew up the historic Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow with explosives. Many major churches in Russia, including St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, were converted to horses' stables. And the Russian Orthodox Church is extensively persecuted throughout Stalin's tenure, throughout the course of the Soviet Union. Atheism is the preferred state religion for decades. The government promoted what was called the Society of the Godless, which had all this propaganda, which rejected the teachings of Jesus and the scriptures and all forms of Christianity and other religions, and advocated atheism as the really only hope and true faith of any true Bolshevik. Stalin created his own youth organization to replace the churches called the Komsomol. The Komsomol, also known as the Young Communist League, was very similar to the Hitler Youth, or the young fascists, in the sense that the young Russian citizens were trained up in communist propaganda and atheism to become servants of the state or to serve in the army. There's a large cult of personality that is promoted surrounding Stalin. Stalin is elevated alongside Lenin and Karl Marx as the great communist leaders in world history. But eventually, Stalin himself becomes the only official to be adored. Indeed, he is adored as a god, promoted as a god, to be venerated and worshipped, that he is all-wise, all-knowing. and all of his dictates should be followed. Stalin, of course, would face the greatest crisis of his tenure with the coming of World War II, which for Russia, which had endured so much in the course of the early 20th century, now experienced even greater suffering because of the events of World War II.
As Western democracies struggled to meet the challenges of the Great Depression, and as totalitarian dictators gained total control of their states, in some ways, these two forces came into conflict on the Iberian Peninsula in the 1930s, the location of the nations of Spain and Portugal. In 1931, the historic and legendary monarchy of Spain came to an end with the proclamation of a new republic. At the time, many Spaniards were hopeful that the leadership of the republic would be able to solve the economic problems Spain faced during the Great Depression. Yet as confidence waned in its leaders, desperate groups contended for control of the government. When a group of socialists and communists gained control of the state and favored the continuance of the republic, they were fiercely opposed by rebel nationalist groups that were more conservative and held more fascist leanings. From 1936 to 1939, Spain would be torn apart between the leftist Republicans and the fascist nationalists. The dispute between the two groups was not unlike the same division that characterized many European states in the 1930s. The nationalists were effectively led by General Francisco Franco. From a young age, Franco served in the Spanish military, rising rapidly to become the youngest general in Europe in the 1920s. He opposed the communist leanings of the Spanish Republic, but remained loyal to the state until the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. Thereafter, Franco led nationalist troops and, when all other nationalist leaders had been killed, became the titular head of the fascist movement. Franco garnered the support of the other fascist heads of state in Europe, including Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, to continue his campaign against the communists in Spain. In fact, much of the war materials that Franco used during the Civil War was supplied by Nazi Germany. Hitler was pleased with Franco's efforts against Spanish communism and continued to reward him with the supplies and weapons he needed to finally drive out the leftist Republicans and secure victory for the nationalists. Franco became the military dictator in Spain and would rule the country as the head of government until his death in 1975. Franco's regime would evolve significantly over the decades of his dictatorship, but in the commencement of his rule, he very much resembled other 1930s heads of state. Franco and the nationalists were responsible for intentionally exterminating tens of thousands of opposing Spaniards to secure nationalist power. Indeed, between Franco's repressive tactics and the scale of the conflict that divided Spain, the Spanish Civil War can be seen as practice or a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. The communist Republicans had been supported by the Soviet Union, and Franco's nationalists had been supplied by the fascists. These two camps would of course fight each other on an even larger scale during World War II. To solidify his control of the government, Franco would keep Spain neutral during World War II, but his previous relationship with Hitler would make him viewed with a high degree of skepticism by the Allied powers for years to come. Spain's neighbor to the west, Portugal, would also see the rise of a strong-armed political figure who would also turn Portugal into a dictatorship. Antonio Salazar was a key finance minister in the Portuguese government after the military seized power in 1926. Salazar effectively managed the nation's finances and consequently accumulated more power to himself. As Portugal enjoyed increased prosperity, Salazar was increasingly accepted by the broader population. While a friend and supporter of Franco in Spain, Salazar was not a supporter of the Axis powers and kept Portugal neutral during World War II while secretly supporting the Allies. Salazar was not afraid to deploy the state's secret police to suppress political rivals, but his dictatorship over Portugal never reached the heights of oppression or murder that characterized the other Axis powers. Nevertheless, Portugal is yet another example of the shocking widespread appeal of totalitarian government on the eve of the Second World War.